Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're letting a couple people in, so I'm going to get started in just a few seconds. All right. So hi, everyone. I'm Selena Burns, and I'm a Program Development Officer for Learning Lab, and I also manage the AI Challenge Awards. Thank you for coming to our webinar on IRB, which I think is going to be extremely useful, both for those of you who are currently putting together grant applications and also for our current grantees who either haven't yet started their IRB process or have started but are struggling with it. I have with me today two IRB experts from UC Davis who are here to answer your questions about IRB, and also representatives from two different Learning Lab projects who are going to share a little more about their IRB experience. And would you all like to just quickly introduce yourselves? Starting with John.
Absolutely. I'm John Tupin. I'm the director at UC Davis IRB, and we're here to help.
Stefan?
Yeah, hi, my name is Stefan Falwell. I work at the UC Davis IRB as our education training and outreach supervisor. So I am really excited to be here today.
Michelle?
Hi there, everyone. I'm Michelle Pacansky-Brock. I'm a professional development faculty member at Foothill De Anza Community College District, and I'm also lead PI for I was lead PI for two Humanizing Online STEM grants. Happy to be here today.
Dee?
Hi, everyone. My name is Dee Xu. I am on the faculty at the School of Education at UC Irvine. I serve as a co-PI and worked with Michelle on the humanization projects.
Hi, everyone. My name is Annalisa Flores, and I'm an assistant professor of teaching in the statistics department at UC Riverside. I'm a PI on what's called the GLADS Path project, which is part of Learning Lab's Grand Challenge, building critical mass for data science.
Thank you for being here, everyone. I also have some of my Learning Lab colleagues here with me today, and they're here to support the webinar. I'm just going to let them say a quick hello to you in chat. All right, if you want to move to the next slide, Lily, we can get started. All right, so to start out, what's an IRB? IRB stands for Institutional Review Board, and their role is to make sure that when you do research with living people, their rights and welfare are protected. There are federal regulations that apply to both medical research and social science research that IRBs will make sure that you're compliant with. And any research that directly or indirectly gets federal funding needs to go through an IRB. But that doesn't mean that you only have to do IRB if your project is federally funded, which any of you who've had to do a dissertation with no money at all are aware. You're using university resources, and most universities get federal funds that go to overhead costs. Also, colleges and universities want to make sure they're legally protected and that your research is ethical, whether or not it has federal funds. So IRBs that review research funded by the Department of Health and Human Services have to register with the government, and there are actually guidelines for who makes up an IRB. Has to have at least 5 members with varying backgrounds, representing both science and non-science. 1 member has to be not affiliated with the institution, but typically most IRB members are your peers. They're often your fellow faculty, make up IRB committees. Next slide. So why is it important? I want to say that I'm actually a fan of IRBs, and I say that as someone with a PhD in education who's fully aware that the IRB approval process can be challenging and at times frustrating, with all due respect to our UC Davis colleagues. But the reason that I'm a fan is that I fundamentally believe in the ethical principles that it's an IRB's job to make sure that we're adhering to as researchers. So those principles are beneficence, which is making sure that the benefits of participation outweigh the harm; respect, which is ensuring that people are able to freely choose whether or not they participate in the research with all the information they need to make an informed decision and their privacy is protected; and justice, that there's fairness in who gets the benefit of being able to participate versus who carries the risks. And one of the reasons I want our applicants to understand the IRB in the proposal process is that these things are all tied to your research design. So for instance, studies that have control groups for a professional development project, they will often after the treatment is done, give access to that professional development for the control group to make sure that everyone has access to the benefits of that professional development. So also, if you are a professor who's trying to research your own students, your design should require you to have someone else recruit your students so that they don't feel pressured to participate. So understanding the IRB ethical principles can help you with the design stage of your project. And if you want to know more about the ethical principles that guide the IRB, you can find those in the Belmont report, which I'm going to have Jamie, my colleague Jamie, put a link to in chat. And that was created as part of the National Research Act of 1974. Next slide. So what can happen without these protections? One of the reasons that we had the Belmont report and had the National Research Act of 1974 was a very unethical study called the Tuskegee syphilis study. And that was a study that was done by the US Public Health Service between 1932 and 1972. They deliberately recruited impoverished sharecroppers with little access to health information. They recruited Black men into the study because they believed that they were particularly susceptible to STDs and not interested in treatment. Participants were told they were getting special treatment for bad blood and they were promised free medical care. And then the control group got placebos. So they got something that wasn't medicine that they were told was medicine. And then they studied the effects of untreated syphilis on them. And as you can imagine, most of the people in the control group eventually died. I think 40 wives were infected. There were unborn children who were infected as well. There was a big newspaper expose about it in 1972 and like a civil lawsuit. And the result of that was the Belmont report and all of these regulations that we now have for federally funded research. And you may be thinking the 1970s, that was a long time ago, and this was medical research, and what does that have to do with the type of research that I'm doing? But unethical research still happens today. So as faculty work at a university, you're required to go through IRBs and to follow these ethical guidelines. But as you probably know or have noticed, for-profit companies out there do marketing research on you all the time. They don't get federal funds and they're not, they don't have to have an IRB. They don't have to align themselves with these ethical principles. So about 10 years ago, there was a research study that Facebook did called the Emotional Contagion Study, where they decided that, that fine print that it's way too long for you to read and you put a check on it whenever you're signing up for any app. They decided having checked that was sufficient consent for being part of any research they wanted to do on you. And they decided to do something where they had two different they had feeds where people were getting just happy posts and feeds where people were getting neutral posts and feeds where people were getting all depressing posts. And unexpectedly, they found that people became a lot sadder when their feeds were showing just depressing posts. But as you can imagine, we all know that social media can have a huge effect on mental health. And so all of that's to say that whenever you're struggling with IRB, if it's taking you a long time, you're getting, asked to make changes, you can just tell yourself you're doing it for a good reason. You're doing it for social justice reasons, for ethical reasons, and at least you are not Facebook out there making people depressed in the name of science with no ethical oversight to it. Okay, next slide. Thank you, Lily. Next slide. The slide had been made prettier in the next version. So these are some examples of typical IRB protections. Subjects must understand the research, its potential risks and benefits, and give their consent freely without pressure or inducement. Subjects should not be exposed to unreasonable risks to their health or well-being beyond those that are normal in everyday life. Subjects have the right to withdraw from the study at any time without losing any of the benefits they're entitled to. Adequate measures should be in place to protect the privacy of participants. And there are particular protections in place for minors or prisoners or other vulnerable populations who may not be able to give informed consent or who may feel especially compelled to participate in research. Next slide. So you may be wondering, does my project require an IRB review? Well, IRB is for research with human subjects, and so you have to look at two things. Is your project research, and does it involve human subjects? Next slide. So the first question, is it research? Research is a systematic investigation, including research development, testing, and evaluation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. And generalizable knowledge is knowledge that contributes to the theoretical framework of established body of knowledge. It is knowledge that is meant to be applied not just to the particular location, but that you should be able to apply it to populations beyond the site of data collection to other settings. Next slide. So typically, we think that that Learning Lab is asking you to do research because, part of Learning Lab is that we want you to contribute to the science of human learning. We're asking you to do research-driven iterative improvements and theory of change-driven impact and outcomes evaluation. We're asking you not just to do things that will work for your classroom, but to figure out if they'll work across contexts and why they work in different contexts and don't work in other contexts. And we want you to disseminate your findings. We want you to be sharing this out in journals and in research conferences. So we think we're asking you to do research. Take your project to your IRB if they decide otherwise. If they are like, no, your program evaluation, lucky you. but we do think that, what we're asking you to do in these grants is likely to be determined as research by a lot of IRBs. Next slide. And then the other question is, are there human subjects in your study? And again, if you're doing education research in the classroom and you are trying out different things with your students and giving them surveys, then there are likely to be human subjects in your study. So you have a human subject if you are collecting information about a living person through intervention or interaction with them, or if you're using, studying, or analyzing, or generating identifiable private information. Next slide. So just to break that down a little bit, interaction is communication or interpersonal contact between the investigator or subject, and that includes surveys. So if you give someone a survey, that counts as interaction. Private information, information about behavior that occurs in a context which an individual can reasonably expect. There's no observation or recording. So typically, if your student goes to class, there's not the expectation that you're recording them for research purposes, and you may later share this information in a journal. And then identifiable private information, which is information for which the identity of the subject is or may readily be ascertained by the investigator. So my advice is that if you're not sure if you're doing research or not, or if you have human subjects or not, check with your IRB. There's usually someone at your IRB who's happy to talk to you. Next slide. So what's particularly tricky about Learning Lab projects in IRB? One thing that's really tricky about our projects is that they often involve multiple institutions, which means getting permission from the IRB of each institution that you're working with, or getting all the institutions to agree to use one IRB. And some institutions might have limits on, on when and how you can use the single IRB. Also, Learning Lab projects often involve community colleges, many of which don't have IRBs because they're not really set up to be research institutions. And then many of your projects, as you're looking at student impact, also involve institutional data, which means that you're dealing not just with an IRB, but also with the Institutional Research Office, which must comply with FERPA, laws that protect student educational data. And so even if you have gotten the project through your IRB, that doesn't mean that IR can't say, hey, we're not going to give you the data unless you do XYZ. It's probably going to be easier if you go through the IRB because they're going to be looking for those things and make sure that you're compliant. But you are kind of dealing with two different offices, which in some schools talk to each other and in some schools may not. And also an important thing to remember with the student data that you're collecting is that even though it may seem to you like you're trying to get anonymous data, a lot of your projects you want to disaggregate by race and gender to look for impact. And if you're dealing with a very small sample size, sometimes you can figure out who someone is just because there's only one or two students like that in the class. And I'm gonna have Jamie send you a couple of links that we hope are gonna be helpful. One of which is a list for community colleges, either of their IRB websites, or if they don't have one, who you should contact at your community college if you want to do research at that institution. The other one for UCs, which UCOP very kindly created for us, is a list that has the websites of all the IRBs at the UCs and also FERPA guidance. And they're working on one for us for the CSU. So we hope that'll be coming soon for UCSU folks. All right, next slide. So what's the good news? The good news is that learning lab projects as education projects are usually minimal risk and meet one of the federal criteria for exempt research, which can mean expedited review, which means that can be one person reviewing and not the whole 5-person IRB team. And no need for ongoing IRB oversight. And also, Learning Lab understands that IRB delays can happen. So just talk to your program officer if your timeline needs to change because you're working on getting IRB approval. Next slide. So I just wanted to quickly explain, without going into a ton of detail, our next IRB webinar is going to go into more detail about FERPA and also exempt research. But the reason why your project probably is going to count as exempt research is that there are two categories of exempt research that I think are pertinent to the type of projects that happen with Learning Lab. One is research of normal educational practices, not likely to adversely impact students' opportunity to learn. And the other is when you're doing surveys, interviews, or public observations where either the participants can't be identified or there's no particular risk because the type of data you're collecting is just not risky or personal in any way, or your IRB's done this sort of expedited review and just made sure that all the necessary data privacy is in place. I always say if you don't try to figure it out yourself, you can turn it into your IRB and they will tell you if you are exempt, give you a letter, and then you will have that in case you want to publish something in a journal that asks if you've done an IRB review. Next slide. All right, some quick tips. So you may want to use a single IRB. If you do, you'll need agreements from the other institutions for this. And also, some of them have restrictions, like they won't do it for exempt studies, or there'll be a limit to how many institutions that they'll do it for. So just be aware of that. Really consider IRB and institutional research when you're in the proposal stage, when you're planning budget and time. Think about, did you put in person hours for the IRB applications because it takes time to do them? Did you put in person hours for training or a budget for community college faculty if they don't have access to training? Because typically to be a PI, the IRB will expect that you've gone through IRB training. There's some free training that's available from the federal government, but often institutions will have a specific training they want you to do, often city training. Sometimes they'll have their own modules that relate to that institution. Did you put in the person hours for making all the consent forms? Does your timeline account for the fact that IRB is going to want to review all your recruitment materials and your research instruments? So they have to be done early, right? You can't wait till right before you want to give that survey to make your survey. You have to make your survey in time to give it to IRB for IRB to look at it. It's common for IRB to ask for some revisions before approval, so make sure that you build in some time for that. And think about reaching out to someone from institutional research ahead of time. Like I've worked on projects where we actually had someone from institutional research as part of the project team, just because they're allowed to look at de-identified data when you're not. So sometimes they can, do some of the statistics for you and then give you that de-identified stuff back. And even if you don't include them, just having that relationship ahead of time, I think can be helpful. And keep in mind that some IRBs might have institutional requirements for being a PI if the PI is working on research. So make sure you check out what those are. It's never too late or too early to get in touch with your IRB office or your IR office. Many IRB websites have sampled templates or are willing to meet with you. And if yours doesn't, just Google it, because there are a ton of IRB websites out there, including UC Davis, that has a lot of templates available for you. And again, just keep in mind that there are special protections for minors. So if your project is with dual enrollment students, or you have minors in your class, that's just something to be aware of. And with that, I am going to turn it over to John and Stefan for your IRB questions and for any tips they want to share. We have both Q&A and chat. And you can also feel free to raise hands or unmute yourselves.
And thank you. That was great. You really hit all the high points, and I want to emphasize that Stefan has largely built our website, and it is full of information, example studies, self-evaluation tools that will help you decide whether or not it's research, or whether it's exempt, or if it's more of a QA/QI effort. So, we really want to be part of this effort. This is such a positive program. So we're also available for consultation for folks. And I will stop talking and let Stefan do the heavy lifting.
Thanks, John. Yeah, this part is just Q&A. If any of you have any sort of questions that you have about IRB in general, and if not, we can share a couple tips that might be helpful for specifically research that's education related, as you would be expected to be conducting as part of the Learning Lab. So when you should submit to an IRB and have some sort of exemption or approval is going to be prior to the initiation of human subjects research. So at UC Davis, it's not uncommon for someone to obviously have a proposal awarded and then get IRB approval, but depending on the funding agency, just so that you all know, there are some funding agencies that want some sort of reassurance that this project has already been submitted to an IRB and approved. I know we see that a lot with NSF and NIH, for example. And so those are something that we will help investigators work with.
So Learning Lab doesn't make you do it before your proposal is submitted. So you would have to do it after your award and before you undertake any of your research.
One caveat is, and probably not for what we're talking about here, is if the IRB asks you to change something in your IRB submission, that may somehow impact your award, and you may need to then go back to the Learning Lab and say, we made this change.
Mm-hmm.
So just be aware of that.
Okay, I'll give some general advice, especially for people who are doing research in California, and things that come up sometimes when you are maybe compensating students as part of studies. It is not uncommon in California or for people to say, I have a little bit of limited funding, and so compensation will do a drawing. And so maybe 1,000 people will complete a survey and we'll give out 100 $25 Amazon gift cards or something like that. Now, in the state of California, we have very specific regulations around lotteries. Not everyone can just have a lottery. And so there is, I know that UC Berkeley and other UCs, including us, will encourage, you can still have drawings like that as a form of compensation, but there has to be some language in the consent document or information sheet or consent form that says that participation in the study is not the only way that you can ask to be included in the drawing. And that's how you get the workaround for something being a lottery. And then the other thing that is a little bit related to compensation is the idea of extra credit. So if you are going to have people as part of your project provide extra credit to, or some sort of course credit to be a participant in studies. I know, like, I went to UC Berkeley. I participated in many studies as part of psychology classes, but there has to be some sort of alternate assignment besides participation in studies where someone can still get credit or extra credit as part of the course. And the other thing to add to that is that that alternate assignment should be commensurate in effort to participating in the study. So if your survey only takes 5 minutes to fill out, it's not appropriate for the commensurate assignment or opportunity for extra credit or credit to be a 5-page essay, because it takes longer than 5 minutes to write a 5-page essay, at least for me. So that is something that sometimes will come up as well. And I see there's a question, so I'll read that and then answer it. Are you able to delve more into the expedited IRB context? For example, if you are conducting the research during the course of teaching your class by using specific curricula, what might be variables to increase the likelihood of being successful with an expedited IRB? So it's very unlikely that you would have some sort of curricula or curriculum that would facilitate or necessitate rather a project needing a full committee review. Unless you were going to shock students when they got incorrect answers or something like that. Because when we think really about these expedited categories and exempt categories, so many of the regulations were built for biomedical research that really educational research oftentimes doesn't actually ever require any sort of committee review unless there's a conflict of interest or something like that, which is I think not as likely to come up in this context either. So I think that's part of that. I would also say too, sometimes people are not always honest with whether or not they think that there might be people under 18 who will be enrolling in their study. If you are dealing with freshmen in college, for example, it's very common for them to be under 18. So just remember that to at least be honest. Sometimes I think people think, oh, I don't know, so I'll just say no to that question about the involvement of minors in this research, and then it comes to bite them later on. So just being aware of that is helpful. The IRB is not the police. We're not out to get you. We're trying to help everyone stay above board so that when research gets published, there's no issues, and the institution stays on, like, the institution is also protected.
So just a little quick thing. So there's kind of several levels of IRB review, and the easiest level is exempt review, and that's going to be the educational context, chart reviews, record reviews, that sort of thing, and surveys. And the federal government has looked at those and said they're so low risk that we're not even going to make you go, through the whole IRB process. You can send it in. Most IRBs still review these, but they review it with a single member of the staff, and they go through it and just look to make sure that you are in compliance with that category. So those move very quickly. In our little world, expedited is a different category, and it's slightly more risky, and it tends to be you're using a medical device or a pharmaceutical, but you're using it the way it's intended, or you're collecting, I swear, hair samples and toenails. That's one of my favorite categories. Or you're doing x-rays. So these are all really very, very low risk, but there's still some risk that they want, and those move very quickly too. So just being aware of those distinctions and planning ahead for the time commitment. I suspect that almost all of these, being educational based, will end up in the exempt. See, I almost did it, which is a very quick but not expedited process. Ha.
Yeah, we have another question. So in community college math classes in the past, we have done studies when introducing graphing calculators, software, etc. These are more observational studies. We didn't need IRBs. For introducing technology such as AI, would we need the IRB? So This is like a very common type of question that we would get on our education hotline at the UC Davis IRB. And you really have to go through the steps of thinking, okay, first off, is my project research? So is it a systematic investigation intended to contribute to generalizable knowledge? I think that we can kind of move past that step, at least with the Learning Lab folks. And so we'll move to that next step. We know we're doing research. Second part is, does it involve human subjects? And I like to kind of have the I call them like the 3 I's. So there's some sort of intervention, as you had mentioned, interaction, or identifiable like private information or biospecimens. Hopefully you all aren't doing too much stuff with biospecimens. And so when you think about interventions, it's sort of like a manipulation of the person's body or their environment. So if you did a study, for example, where you cranked down the AC for one section of your classes, and then you cranked up the heat in the other section, and you said, we'll see how these folks perform on a math test, that is considered an intervention and human subjects research. The other I, being an interaction, is like that whole like interpersonal communication. So surveys, interviews. We at UC Davis also include focus groups in that. And the interaction does not have to be contemporaneous. So it doesn't have to happen simultaneously. It also doesn't have to be in person. So if you're doing an online survey, that's still considered an interaction, for example. And the last one is the access to identifiable private information, so people's grades and things like that. So when you're asking this question about, maybe before you didn't go through an IRB, that could have been for several reasons. At that institution, it could have been that there was really no intervention or interaction or access to identifiable private information or biospecimens, or it could be, just a different institutional requirement, because every institution is a little bit different. And so it's less about like the specifics that you're asking of like, oh, it's software now, this is AI, so does that count as an interaction? Or no, it doesn't. It's these definitions don't change. So the answer is it depends, but maybe not. It's less about the varied specifics of the study intervention or specifics in this case, because for us, software is software in some instances. So I kind of answered your question, I feel like, but just going slowly through the actual thought process instead of like working backwards is sometimes helpful. So it could be, it could also not be.
All right, thank you. We're going to switch over to having some of our grantees share their IRB experiences, but feel free to keep asking questions in chat, and John and Stefan will answer them if they can.
All right. Hi, everybody. So I'm Annalisa Flores. I'm at UC Riverside in the Department of Statistics. I'm going to start by providing you some context of what our project looks like and kind of who's involved, and then share the kind of data we're interested in, as well as our experience with our IRB process thus far. So I am working on this project called the Greater LA Data Science Pathways Project, which is part of Learning Lab's Grand Challenge, Building Critical Mass for Data Science, with the hopes of creating infrastructure for data science pathways. And I'm working with my colleague, Dr. Miriam Saloom, who is in the Department of Computer Science. So I'm in statistics, she's in computer science. We are at UCR, our data science program is an intercollegiate STEM major, which means that our major is across 2 departments, so stat and computer science, but also each of these departments is in different colleges. So the statistics department is in the College of Natural and Agricultural Sciences and College of Engineering. So neither myself or Dr. Saloom have education and research background. We do have a lead evaluator who is another colleague from the Department of Psychology, who is in another college, which is the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at UCR. But she's a cooperating faculty with UCR's Graduate School of Education. So she's sort of really helping us navigate this and will be the lead person in charge of the data collection and evaluation. So that's just sort of who we are. Next slide, please. The project itself is very ambitious. So we are a collaboration of 8 partnering institutions, which include UC Riverside, 2 Cal State schools, and 5 community colleges. And our goal, as I mentioned, is to create these data science pathways, but each one of our institutions is sort of at a different stage of this development. And so we have different initiatives, including creating the programs themselves, creating some of the classes, creating interest, creating certificates across these institutions, and sort of learning from one another and making sure that we're developing things in a way that makes these pathways accessible. In addition to creating those programs, we're also looking at improving student learning outcomes through support services. So things like mentoring and undergraduate learning assistance, so like a tutoring program that will help students persist through their education in data science. So those are our initiatives. As far as the research, we're trying to really evaluate the effectiveness of how these courses are created and whether or not students can jump on this pathway and then continue through. So maybe they started a community college and they've taken a course, or maybe get an associate's degree and then would like to transfer to a 4-year college. You know, what does it look like? Do they continue in data science? Do they minor? Do they get a bachelor's degree? So we would like to track a little bit of that information. But also we want to know, do they develop technical and professional skills as they're taking these courses or participating in these digital badging opportunities that, you know, sort of allow them to upskill in their data science field. And then on top of all of those things is, do we have students who feel like they belong in data science? So community building, this sort of sense of belonging that will ensure that they stay on the data science pathways and then hopefully end up in a career in data science. So lots of information that we're trying to track and gather across these 8 institutions. Next slide, please. We have a very big project team because there are so many institutions involved and because we have so many initiatives. So you can see that our project team consists of generally multiple people from each institution, but we do have some of our partnering institutions who their data science program is really early on in stages of development. And so they only have 1 person working on those data science efforts there. So we sort of have this overall project structure, as you can see on the screen, but really I want you to focus on the yellow box, which sort of highlights that as far as the evaluation process. The first step was to identify a single person at each institution that could be our main point of contact, so that when we are trying to identify courses or trying to figure out the IRB process, that we're all sort of on the same page and we're able to, you know, make sure that we're doing the things that we need to be doing when we need to be doing them. Next slide, please. As far as the actual data collection itself, once we've identified everybody, we discussed a lot about how we can track all of these initiatives and support programs. And we're mostly going to be doing it through surveys. So pre and post surveys in specific courses that we find align across all of our institutions. So an example would be like an intro to Python class, or maybe like a data science fundamentals class, where we can do a pre and post survey to track students' knowledge and technical skill gain throughout that course, as well as their sense of belonging. And then some more focused surveys for students who are participating in tutoring services. So those are really based on attendance at those services and wouldn't go out to everybody. We're also looking at program level data. So depending on the institution, if your institution has a major, then we would pull all of the information for students enrolled in that major and give them a survey, as well as like minors or certificates. From those surveys, we are going to end up taking a subgroup of students that we can conduct focus groups with, which will be led by our lead evaluator and a research assistant, just to get more, I guess, qualitative data and more in-depth explanations to some of the answers we're looking for. And then, of course, we're looking at institutional-wide data so that we can track demographics and interest in the programs. So lots of data. And I want to mention at this point that because we're looking at specific courses across the institutions, those courses are not always going to be taught by members of our project team. And so one of the really sort of struggles we had is how do we obtain student information for each of those courses, which is, I guess, really gets tied back to our lead evaluator at each institution being responsible for obtaining rosters and student information so that we can conduct those surveys. Next slide. So now that you have an idea of all the type of data we're collecting and what our team looks like and all of our initiatives, the next thing I want to talk about is sort of our initial plan, keyword initial, for our IRB protocol. Because we have people at each institution that are going to be interacting with the data and with the students, we first needed to make sure that all of those lead evaluators had our human subject research training. UCR, we're required to do city training, specifically the social and behavioral research training, which is completely online and requires completing a few modules. It doesn't take a super long time, but you do obviously have to commit to the time to run through those. So that was our first step. While everybody was working on those at each of the institutions, our lead evaluator was helping us complete our IRB protocol through a new system that we got at UC Riverside. But our idea was that we were going to submit a single IRB of record and that UCR would sort of have oversight of all the other institutions. So we would have to establish reliance agreements that allowed UCR to kind of be the one IRB that was overlooking everything. And then also completing data sharing agreements so that our lead evaluator could get the necessary data. We ran into a problem with this. So UCR will only serve as the IRB of record for up to 2 external sites, but we have 7 external sites. So this was a pretty big roadblock for us in trying to figure out how we were going to deal with that and you know, sort of pivoting in our process for our IRB. So next slide. So what we moved on to approaching was that each institution would just submit their own IRB protocol. We knew that some of the partnering institutions, because we have 5 community college partners, might not have an IRB, but we were hoping that it would be 2 or less that don't have an IRB. Turns out it was more than 2. So unfortunately, this process of having each institution complete their own and then UCR just covering the 2 also isn't going to work out. So I'll talk in a moment about sort of our next step because we're still working through this. So we don't have it concluded yet. But that was really our biggest hurdle. As sort of a secondary hurdle was the training that everybody needed to complete at each one of the institutions. So UCR and the Cal State schools had access to the city training through their organization. So you go to the website, you say, I'm affiliated with this school, you log in using your institution's credentials, you get access. Very simple. But I think all of our community college faculty did not have access to city training. So they had to register as independent learners. And there are 2 ways to complete this. So either you pay to access the course or the modules that you need, which we were trying to avoid because we did not budget this in our grant because we didn't really think about it in our planning stages, to be honest. So we were trying to avoid each of our 5 community college faculty from having to pay for this. But it turns out there was actually another way. So each one of those community college faculty could actually register as an independent learner and then choose UCR as an affiliate and then choose the appropriate course without having to pay. And so we were able to actually get everybody the training, though it did cause a lot of delays trying to access and figure out the right way to sign in. But ultimately, we did achieve this. Next slide, please. So these are sort of our challenges that I've listed here. And then on the right side of your screen are sort of our successes, where I guess I should have started from saying that all of our evaluators have now completed the necessary training. So that was nice. We got all those certificates and they could be submitted to our IRB at UCR to show that everybody has the necessary training. The other really big win for us is just having a project lead evaluator, our colleague in the psychology department, who understands this process very well, was able to complete the IRB application pretty quickly, understanding sort of what information was going to be required. What does the student audience look like that we're targeting, descriptions of the courses that we're looking at, ways that we're trying to motivate students to complete and participate, as well as having that extra credit opportunity that was previously mentioned by Stefan. So all of this stuff went really well. She has completed lots of focus groups, so she understood those procedures and had all that information. And I think if you're used to the IRB application, it's pretty straightforward, but it's like 20 pages at our institution or so. So it's quite lengthy and can feel very overwhelming if you don't have that experience. So one of my biggest tips would be finding somebody to be on your project team who is familiar with it and can help you through that process so that it's not so overwhelming. And then right now we're sort of working with our IRB office at UCR, who may, we don't have a final answer yet, be willing to provide oversight for additional external sites. So instead of limiting to 2, we might be able to have the CSUs complete their own, but maybe UCR can cover the community colleges, since some of them don't have their own IRB. And additionally, it would create a lot of extra work for particularly our one community college who only has a single person working on this project. And so those are some of the things that maybe we didn't plan well enough for or didn't know to plan well enough for. So hopefully by me letting you all know what our challenges were, you can think ahead and try to get in front of that instead of sort of being where we're at right now, where it's delayed us a few months in getting our IRB approval because we've been navigating sort of all of these hiccups along the way. I think that's all I have. So if there are any questions, I can hopefully answer them or depend on our IRB experts here.
There was a question in the chat earlier. What departments are your data science certificates and degrees placed within your institutions?
So right now, the community colleges are the ones with the certificate programs, and they're in their computer science departments. Yeah, UCR does have a certificate, an online certificate program offered through their computer science department as well, I believe. I'm not sure if I missed any other questions that may have come through chat.
All right. Thank you, Annalisa. And if you think of questions for her, feel free to drop them into chat and she can be checking. But let's move on to our next Learning Lab grantee team.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Pacansky-Brock, and I'm here with my colleague, Dee Zhu. And we are here to represent 2 grants that we're going to tell you a little bit about and specifically talk to you about IRB. Both grants were pertaining to the topic of humanizing online STEM courses. And I served as lead PI for both of these grants. As part of my lead PI role, I also oversaw the professional development piece of the grant, as well as supported the research and provided overall leadership and communications for the grant project. And do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Michelle. My name is Dee Zhu. I am on the faculty at the School of Education at UC Irvine, and it's such a great honor and a pleasure working with Michelle on this project. My main responsibility is to assist the team and lead the research team at UCI to do data collection, data analysis, and work with Michelle to write a report to summarize the findings from the data we have collected. Michelle is going to introduce in more detail about the different kinds of data we have collected. It definitely is a fun process because we worked with so many different kinds of data. We encountered different challenges. But overall, I think it's a really great project to work on. I learned so much from navigating with working with multiple institutions for this project.
As did I. Thank you, Dee. And I forgot to say that I'm here representing Foothill De Anza Community College District, which is the district that the grants were awarded to. And UC Irvine was one of our sub-awardees on both grants. And as Dee mentioned, that is where our research team was based, and they managed the data collection and the data analysis, which I provided support for. But we'll talk a little bit more in detail about how all that worked. And we do have a project website, which is noted at the bottom. I'll share this link later as well, but it's humanizeol.org, and you'll get lots more information about our project there. Okay, go ahead and go to the next slide, Lily. Thanks. So as I mentioned, the formatting looks like it's maybe a little messed up on some of these slides, so just want to acknowledge that. But as I mentioned, we have been awarded 2 grants. The first one was awarded back in 2019, which seems like a lifetime ago to most of us because so much has happened in the world since then. And it ran for 3 years. And this grant was it fell under the Learning Lab category of one of their innovation grants, and I believe it was the first series of grants that was awarded. So that was exciting to also be part of that. And then after that grant ended, we received a scaling grant from the Learning Lab that ran from 2022 to 2024, and so that grant just wrapped up in June, and we're still putting together the final evaluation right now. Lily, can you click one more time on the slide? And both of these grants had 2 main threads, a professional development thread and a research thread. And so that's really important to understand. One more click, Lily. Actually, 2 more clicks, do one more. Okay. And so for the innovation grant, what we focused on in the professional development thread of that grant was we developed what we now refer to as a model for humanized online teaching and learning. And it was really focused on going into the research, looking for evidence-based practices. We were looking for culturally responsive teaching and also psychologically safe course design, and putting together strategies and humanizing elements that now we refer to as this humanized online teaching model. And on our website, we have an infographic that walks you through that model. And then what we did was we developed a professional development program that we called the Humanizing Online STEM Academy. It was a 6-week asynchronous professional development program. And essentially, we invited STEM faculty as well as faculty support specialists like instructional designers and learning designers from our partner institutions, because we believe they're key in supporting transformations and innovations in teaching and learning. And they completed the academy. We had a pilot that ran during this grant after a couple years after we got everything ready and in place. And that pilot allowed for us to collect some data and some feedback about the academy and make improvements to it. But it also allowed us to test our research instruments and refine those along the way as well. And then actually, when we scaled it out in the 3rd year of the 2nd to 3rd year of the grant, that's when we scaled it out to 8 institutions, and we had 82 completions of the academy. The last phase of that grant was sharing everything out on our website. So we have a very robust resources section on our website that will also allow you to access a toolkit if you'd like to check that out. And so the research component was really about trying to understand what are the experiences of faculty who teach humanized online classes, so faculty who complete the academy and apply this model of humanized online teaching, and the students who take those humanized online classes. And in a moment, I'll explain what data we collected to answer those questions. And then for the scaling grant, we had the academy, and the academy is always being refined. We're always making changes to it as we go, based upon things like, oh, this tool got updated, or that this tool now has a new interface. And so we'd have to go back in and make changes based upon, to be sure that it remained current. And I'm sure many of you know how that feels. And so we had the Humanizing Academy, and we were so excited to be able to get this scaling grant and continue to offer it to more institutions. So we scaled from 8 institutions up to 18. And by the end of the scaling grant, we had another 248 completions. So with both grants together, our total number of completions is 330. And the research question that we're asking with the scaling grant is, what is the impact of humanized online teaching on students' academic performance? I should note that these grants were very much focused on closing equity gaps. And so that's where we're at now, is looking at some of the institutional data to understand how it's impacting student performance. Next slide, please. So the types of data that we collected in Grant 1 were all qualitative, very, very rich qualitative study. As Dee will attest, we had a lot of data that we collected. We did 2 waves of faculty surveys. We interviewed faculty, we surveyed faculty before they completed the academy as well as after the academy, and that allowed us to look for changes in their perceptions and some of their reported teaching behaviors. We also did 3 waves of longitudinal faculty interviews. So this was a deep dive sample to really start to understand more richly what the experiences of the faculty were. And so it was the same 10 faculty, and we interviewed each of them before the academy, after they finished the academy, and then after they taught their first humanized online class. We also did student surveys at the start of their humanized online class and at the end, which allowed for us to look for things like changes in things like belonging, and other measures that we looked for in the student surveys. The student focus groups were also completed, and those were done with students at the end of their class. They were either focus groups or interviews, depending on whether or not we had enough students respond to our call. We do have a research brief, and Jamie's got the link to that brief, which Dee just put it in the chat. Thanks, Dee. Thanks, Dee. That summarizes our findings if you want to take a look at that later. It's pretty exciting, and it's work that we're super proud of, and it's really wonderful to see this groundbreaking work come out of California. We are big believers that online classes provide access to students who have been typically left out of higher education for a very long time, and so we think this is very important work. And the data types collected for Grant 2 were qualitative. We did the surveys for faculty, and then also quantitative. So we are collecting institutional record data, and I'll give you a link that you can check out and take a look at the types of data that we requested. Next slide. So the process that we used for both grants, we went with the blanket IRB approval. So we got data, our blanket IRB approval came through Foothill De Anza. Our data collection was overseen by one institution, which was UC Irvine. And our IRB, the IRB application lists all the institutions that would be part of that data collection. And we refer to those folks as our research partners, those institutions as our research partners. We collected a reliance IRB from UC Irvine, which was the institution overseeing the data collection. And UC Irvine also did a FERPA review to be sure that the data that was being collected and the process used complied with FERPA. The other thing we did is we obtained a memorandum of understanding or an MOU from each research partner institution. And that MOU included a data variable list that really detailed what it was that we were going to be collecting from them. And we found that very, very helpful and very, very useful. We also found that the amount of time that each institution took to get that MOU back to us varied dramatically. So plan for time for that. The visual down below is just to reiterate that we had a lot more institutions participating than we collected data from. So just a little bit of a visual there. Next slide. So the lessons that we learned, just real quick, 3, the devil is in the details. Institutions may have additional conditions for data collection, and these may or may not be listed somewhere. So they can be difficult to track and also difficult to remember, particularly if you're dealing with multiple institutions. And I outline an example here on the slide that I'm not going to read to you just for the sake of time, but there's a lot of details to manage. And so when you're thinking about designing your project, know that the more institutions that you're working with, the more details you're going to have too. And so take your time to really get your arms around all those details. The data that gets collected will vary from institution to institution. So we had some institutions that coded data differently, and that complicated things when it came to the collection time. The amount of time that it took to clean the data was pretty intensive. And the data was also often reported in different formats. So for example, while some institutions provided Excel data in Excel, which could be manipulated pretty easily, others provided large data sets in PDFs that then had to be converted over into Excel. So again, lots of time needed for that. And as I already mentioned, the more institutions you work with, the more complex these different variations are, and the more challenging it can be to manage. Next slide. So applying lessons learned, when we got to our second grant, we were really excited to scale to 18 institutions, but Dee and I had a heart-to-heart, and we really thought about what we went through and what we learned from the first grant. And we still decided to limit our data collection to 3 institutions. And when I say institutions, one was actually a district that collected data at the district level. So there were 3 colleges within that district, 1 community college and 1 CSU. And that was, again, like I said, to avoid the exponential increases in the challenges that we encountered in Grant 1. Next slide. So additional recommendations, relationships are really important. So take time to start early and build relationships with your institutional research contacts. After the IRB approval is obtained, we really recommend providing a memorandum of understanding template to each participating institution and include a return by date. At that time, you may hear, oh, we're not going to get it signed by then, or it'll give you a better understanding of how long it might take on the institution's end. We had some institutions that signed the MOU and others that said, oh, we have our own. And then there's always the possibility that they may take the template and then add something to it and refine it. But having a template to start with is really helpful. And we have an example that that we'll be providing if it hasn't been in the chat already. And in the MOU, we provided a data variables list as an addendum. And so having that all part of one document is really helpful because it's less documents to manage and just one place to look. It's helpful to have a single point of contact for research-related communications. Email is really hard, and when the folks you're working with get familiar with a person's name, it can make it a little bit easier because then, it stands out a little bit more in their inbox. With regards to those emails, be clear and consistent. Really take the time to write emails that are clear and consistent. Use a bulleted list. Boldface the ask so it stands out in your email, and always include a please respond by date. These things really do make a big difference. Next slide. And these are our resources that we have available. And Jamie has just shared them in the chat, or the sample MOU. I think the other ones possibly may already have been shared, but we've got a sample MOU provided by UC Irvine. Thank you for sharing that, Dee. And also we're providing our sample data variables list, so you can take a look at it. Again, that's the thing that was included as an appendix in the MOU that was signed by our research partners. And a link to our Humanizing Online STEM website, where you'll find lots of goodies there, including showcases from our Academy participants, an infographic of the humanized online teaching model, and of course our research brief. And I have once you get the slides, I have the direct link embedded there for that too. And that's it for us. I believe we're now going to turn to Q&A with the rest of our time here and see what questions you folks have for us. And as the questions are coming in, I just want to say, you can do this. I know it's intimidating, and I know particularly for those of us who work at community colleges, you may be thinking, this isn't in our wheelhouse, right? We're not, like, research usually isn't something that we do all the time because we are teachers if we're in a faculty role, but you can do this. You do have a lot of support. And you've got more support than we did when we started, right? Because the Learning Lab has evolved so much over those years as well.
We're a pretty small group, so if folks want to unmute themselves to ask a question, it should be okay to do that as well.
Yes, as we are waiting for people to chime in, one thing I would like to add is I totally agree with Michelle that you can definitely do this. It's very challenging, but depending on the type of data you are going to collect, I think might be helpful to plan ahead of time to make the process, just to make it easier. It's never going to be easy, but with a lot of planning, you can kind of like alleviate the complexity. Like for us, we are collecting survey data and interview data from participants from multiple institutions. So when Michelle and I, when we went through the IRB process, what we have learned is if the institutions where the participants came from are not directly involved in the data collection process. For example, if we are not asking someone from a given community college district to help us send out the survey, then this means that they are not actively participating in the data collection process. So sometimes it will be waived, that they won't be required to go through the Reliance IRB process. So this helped speed up the process substantially. There were still some districts or some institutions they required going through the IRB and Reliance, setting up the Reliance IRB, but most of the institutions were not requiring going through additional separate Reliance IRB review at their own institution. So that's a really important lesson we have learned, that if possible, making the data collection centralized, only the research team from one institution getting in charge of all of the data collection, that could potentially reduce the amount of work that you have to go through to set up Reliance IRB from multiple institutions.
There was a question in the chat asking, what is a blanket IRB?
I believe that's referring to a single IRB. So a single IRB is a mandate from the federal government that reduces the amount of reviews, and it puts all of the review on a single IRB. They represent all of the institutions that are involved by agreement, called a Reliance. And they are in charge of approving and managing any changes and then closing out the research. The good news is I don't think that any of these grants would be covered under that requirement, but individual institutions, if they are going to put their faith in another institution, will probably want a Reliance of some sort. But they're pretty streamlined unless there is particular clauses that an institution wants to put in there.
All right, if there are no other questions, we're going to drop a quick survey into chat because we're always wondering how we did and how we can improve. So please fill it out. And I'm also gonna let, if she's still here, Lisa from WestEd talk to you a little bit about our follow-up IRB webinar in 2 weeks.
Hi, thank you, Selena. Hello, everybody. I really enjoyed this session. I really enjoyed hearing the wonderful questions that came out. And, you know, some of the quotes that just jumped at me, you know, when John said that, you know, and Stefan, that we're here to help, that's the spirit of, you know, the research that you can go into with IRB. They are not, as you said, Stefan, that you iterated, it's not like a police. It is a support unit out there for you. And also, John mentioned this too, there might be iterations. Dee, you spoke about it. It is a process, and that's what we'll stress when we go over our session, the different process involved. We'll dive deeper into risk. We'll talk a little bit more about some other regulations that are involved, like FERPA, and, you know, take a look at some sort of examples that we can walk through, with the caveat that, again, your institutions might have their own policies on board and their own interpretations of things. So getting to know them and working with them early on is a really great idea.
All right, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you so much to our grantees and to our UC Davis IRB representatives for coming and helping us out today. And if people have questions that for the Learning Lab that are not IRB related, we'll try to stay on for a couple more minutes, or you can always email info@californialearninglab.org. Thanks everyone for coming. Fill out the survey. Let us know how we did and how we can improve.